Welcome, folks. We're going to go ahead and get started. We know a few other folks will be trickling in. First and foremost, just a couple of welcomes. Kurt, welcome back to Santa Clara.
Thank you.
Good to have you back, and excited to talk to you today. Welcome all of you. Thanks for coming for the discussion and for some questions that we'll be able to ask Kurt. And then a special thanks for the collection of campus units who helped to put this together and to sponsor Kurt's Day today as well. So the Ignatian Center, the Career Center, Library and Learning Commons, Alumni Association, and the Communications Department. We're all real excited to welcome the illustrious Kurt Wagner back to campus. So,
thank you. Can I say something as well? Just thank you, and that this is like a surreal and very cool thing for me to get to do. This is my, I've been a journalist for a long time, but this is my first book, and I've never, the thought of like coming back to your alma mater to have a day like this is really special. So thanks to Mike for setting it up, but also thanks to all of you for making time in your day to come do this. It's a very cool thing for me. So thanks.
Great. We'll start real briefly as we kick things off with the university's land acknowledgement. So we pause now to acknowledge that Santa Clara University sits on the land of the Ohlone and the Muwekma Ohlone people, who trace their ancestry through the missions Dolores, Santa Clara, and San Jose. We remember their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homeland. So let us take a moment of silence to pay respect to their elders and to the Ohlone people past and present. Okay. So kicking things off, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. So Mike Nuttall, and I serve as the Assistant Vice President for Mission and Ministry. This is my 14th year here at Santa Clara. I'm usually in the back of the room for events, but this is sort of a special occasion to get to be up here in the hot seat a little bit. Three main reasons for that. So number one, I am a technophile, and so this is generally an interest area for me. Ironically, Kurt is not, despite his work, so there's kind of a fun piece there. Second, a lot of my work and professional interest is in the area of leadership, and for me, reading the book, while it is about Twitter and technology, there's a major through line there about leadership and what makes good or less good leadership at times. And then the third one is that 3 weeks after I started at Santa Clara 14 years ago, Kurt and I went on an immersion trip that I was leading, and Kurt was a student. And so we've known each other for 14 years, and I've served as a mentor and a friend with Kurt for a long time, so it's also fun for us to have a little conversation about it. So now we'll talk about the award-winning author, Kurt Wagner, working at Bloomberg since 2019, has covered social media since 2013, worked at Recode, Mashable, Fortune, graduated with a BS in Communication and Political Science in 2012, 2-year stint as editor-in-chief of the Santa Clara, Ignatian Center immersion participant and trip leader to New Orleans, a recipient of, and I quote here Kurt saying, various SCU student awards that are nice, but no one probably cares about except for me and my mom. Seattle native, passionate Seattle sports fanatic, proud father of 2, Jack and Peyton, proud partner to Jess, also an SCU alum and an all-around amazing human. And now they live in Denver, and you can be found at a startup social media company that you may have heard of called X with @Kurt Wagner 8. Did I get anything?
You nailed that.
Excellent. Thank
you.
you.
If I'd known you were going to read it word for
wouldn't
word,
have
I
quoted
might
that.
have written things differently. Thank you.
So our plan for today. So Kurt and I are just going to chat a bit about the book, about journalism, and about time at Santa Clara. Kind of weave some of those pieces through. And then we'll open up the floor for questions to you all, and then we'll just continue on until 5 o'clock. Kurt has signed the books over there and also will be available afterwards if anyone wants a personalized touch within their book. So with that, we'll go ahead and dive in. You good?
I'm great.
All right.
Let's do it.
Tell us a little bit about how the project started of the book and sort of where the original idea and impetus came from.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I've covered social media for a decade. So I've been covering Twitter and writing about Twitter for a very long time. And I thought to myself, if I was ever going to write a book, Twitter would be the subject. Not only because I find it to be super important service for culture and politics and sports, but it was something I just knew really well. And if you followed the company, it's had a real roller coaster existence as a business. And so, I'll bring you back, I suppose, to early 2022, a couple years ago, and I thought, now it's time to write a book. I just had, my wife had just had our son, and I was ready for a big challenge because my life was never going to be the same now that I had this, little person in my life. And I thought, okay, now's the time for the Twitter book that I've been thinking about. I wrote a 30-page proposal. I, reached out to publishers through an agent and was doing meetings, and Elon Musk showed up as Twitter's largest shareholder the same exact week that I was pitching my Twitter book to publishers. And you might think, wow, what fortunate timing, which is partly true. The story got so much more interesting and significant than I ever thought it would, thanks to the takeover and everything we can talk about. But in the moment, I was quite upset because every publisher wanted to know how Elon was going to fit into the book. And I was basically like, he's not. He's he's just showing up. He's going to join the board. Big deal. I'll throw a chapter at the very end. And so I kind of fought this idea of making it a Twitter Elon related book for a long time because I thought I had this great idea already. And as the story evolved and things morphed, like any journalist will tell you, you follow the story, right? And eventually I got it through my thick skull that this was a much better book if I sort of adapt it that way. But it didn't start actually as a Twitter takeover book. It sort of morphed into that.
To paint a picture too of that timeline, because it's pretty incredible. So you've got one day it gets announced Musk is a major shareholder, largest shareholder, I think at the time.
Yep.
And I think that timing from that till when he officially owned a company was
A month. Yeah. And I lived and breathed this for a long time, both as it was unfolding for Bloomberg, but also obviously looking back on it as I wrote the book. He showed up as the largest shareholder. It was a surprise. The company wasn't aware he'd been building this big stake in Twitter. They originally sort of wanted to head him off a little bit because anytime someone shows up and owns 10% of your company, it's a risk as a business. And so they wanted to play nice, and they invited him to join the board. They had, board members had dinner with him. They basically talked, how can we work together? How can we make this collaborative? And originally he wanted the same, and he agreed to join the board. It was announced. There's been a ton of text messages that have come out in an eventual legal dispute that shed some really fun light into this, and they're all in the book. But very quickly after agreeing to join the board, he had a change of heart, and there's reasons for that we can get into, but he basically said, forget it. I've changed my mind. I'm not joining the board, and in fact, prepare for a takeover offer. And within 2 weeks, he had signed a merger agreement to buy the company for $44 billion. So from a business journalist standpoint, I mean, this is like a story that was a total tornado. You go from literally a month earlier not even associating Elon Musk with Twitter to now he's bought the company for this massive amount of money, and there's been all this drama in the middle that was really fascinating as to how we got there.
So as you go then from, you're pitching a book of which Elon is not a part of, 30 days later, Elon is a star.
Yeah.
Where does that go with you? How quickly is your timeline then in terms of adjusting that topic?
So this gives you a sense of how set I was on my original idea. I was still, even at that point, basically like, okay, fine, I'll throw a chapter about him in at the end. Because once you write a 30-page book proposal, you spend months and months thinking what this book is you want to write, this idea that someone's going to come in right at the last minute and totally blow it up, it's just hard for you to wrap your head around. So I would say this was all happening in April. I would say it probably took until August, September, honestly, for me to come to grips with the fact that I couldn't just keep adding new chapters onto my existing idea. And I was thankful that I had a good editor at Bloomberg who basically knocked some sense into me. We had a conversation. He was like, what are you doing? This is like a business journalist's dream, right? Like the richest man in the world showed up and is buying the company you are writing a book about. Like, you should be ecstatic. And I think once that flip was switched, did I say that right?
Yeah. He's an author, folks.
You
so
know
it's
what
just-
I'm saying.
different, yeah.
Whenever that thing happened in my brain, it just became so much clearer, right? And I started redoing my outline. I started redoing the title. I started redoing sort of the way I was thinking about the project. And thankfully I did, because I think it's just such a much more interesting story as a result.
Absolutely. I have a quick aside question before we do more into the book. You sort of mentioned this briefly, that you chose to sit down and do a really challenging adventure of writing a book after your kiddo was born.
Yeah.
As a father of two, the thought would not enter my mind to try an additional life challenge, to try and write a book that you haven't done at the moment at which you had already started a new life challenge. Just curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't say it was a good decision.
Okay.
I don't know, for other folks who've had children in this room, perhaps you can relate. Obviously it was the first one, so I didn't know what to expect, but I just remember thinking, how can my life go back to, how can I show up at work and kind of do the exact same thing I was doing before this moment happened to us as a family? And so I thought, this is a great time to take some big swing, or to like really mix things up. We ended up, my wife and I had a second child while I was writing the book as well. That was probably more of an issue. And it's a good thing she's not here probably to weigh in on that.
That's fair. So the book is about a number of things. In some ways, at its simplest form, you can say, oh, there's a book about Twitter and its transition. But you really tell the book about Jack Dorsey and Elon Musk. I'm curious around just your thought on, was that framing of kind of going through initially kind of focusing on Jack and telling a story of Twitter through Jack, and then obviously adding on the chapter, we'll call it, also known as the second half of the book, for Elon Musk. But I'm just curious around, like, it's not necessarily, like, you could frame that as a conversation about the company and its product and its trajectory, but it really, you focused on the people within that. Just kind of curious around that.
I think one of the things that I've always tried to do, and what I learned before I started Bloomberg, I worked at a place called Recode, which is a tech and business outlet. It's now owned by Vox Media, but it was founded by two very established journalists, Kara Swisher and Walt Mossberg. And one of the things I learned while I was there is that all of these tech companies they're managed and run and shaped by human beings, right? Like, we think of them as an app on our phone, or maybe the phone itself, but that's coming out of the brain of a person. And so to really put the people at the front of our coverage, and when we talk about these companies, and I don't think you can really understand this takeover, even though this is a perhaps traditional business story. You can't really understand it without understanding the people involved. Jack Dorsey, the former CEO of Twitter, being one, he really, like, the dominoes that ultimately were set up to lead to this deal were set up by him, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And then, of course, Elon Musk coming and buying the company. And so for me, I think it made a lot of sense to center the story around human beings and not just a business or a technology. One, it's more interesting, but two, it's like, I just think that's how the story, that's how you can understand these things better. You can't understand the story without understanding the personalities of those two individuals.
Yeah, the book sets up this fascinating sort of Venn diagram with the two of them, of like how much stylistically they are different, and sort of this like subtlety with Jack in so many ways, and a lack of subtlety with Elon. That it's really fascinating sort of how you weave those pieces together. As you talk about, let's switch a little bit and talk about sort of a little bit more on Twitter and business. One of the key kind of points that I think you make in the book, and certainly clarify if this is a fair characterization, but around that there was sort of like this stature of Twitter in terms of like its place within media, its place as a source for news, often compared with other major social media companies, Facebook, Instagram, et cetera. And also sort of lofted up. And then also there's like the business of Twitter and its financial models and how sustainable it was. And you talk about sort of like a chasm between those two. So one, just like, is that a fair characterization of that? And sort of what are some of the key pieces in your own words about kind of the reality of that?
Yeah, I think people are often surprised to learn how small Twitter, the business is, because they think of Twitter, they're familiar with the brand. For 4 years, we saw a sitting U.S. president, tweet 20 times a day, right? And I think it had a place or has a place in culture, politics, society that feels big and meaningful. And then when you look at the numbers and you look at the business behind it, you're like, oh, wow, that's, I'm making this up. I should know because I wrote a book about it. But it will say, 5% the size of Facebook, right? And yet you lump them together, or people historically have always been like, oh, it's Twitter and Facebook. And you take that for granted that it's, or people don't realize it's so small. I think that's really important for a number of reasons. Number one, I think it helps explain some of the shortcomings of the company over the years, was that it truly didn't have the resources to do some of the things that it wanted to do. I think it also explains why a single individual could come buy the entire company, right? No single person could go buy Facebook. It's just too expensive. But with Twitter, it was always sort of in play because it had this really small business. And so I spent some time in the book talking about that simply because I feel that it's a misconception that a lot of people held. And once you sort of grasp that there was that disconnect between influence and size, it helps explain a little bit as to why all this was possible.
Yeah. One of the things that really stood out for me in the book was around the 3-year plan that was pitched. Kind of is like they're trying to kind of save Twitter at the sort of the tail end of Dorsey's time, and just that the numbers that they put up internally and then the goals that they put up externally as well. Just I understand the idea about presenting audacious goals, and just like the incredible gap between here's what we're committed to in terms of number of users and then ad revenue relative to where they actually were, sort of like a preposterous gap between those two. And so just kind of curious around, like, what was the circumstances that you felt sort of either forced or invited Twitter into a space of committing to that such audacious goals where it just seemed to be really broken from reality?
So I'll attempt to summarize this really quickly. Right when COVID happened, early 2020, some outside investors tried to fire the CEO of Twitter. They took a big stake in the company. They came in and they demanded that the company get rid of Jack Dorsey. Short version, there's a whole chapter about this, which I find really fascinating, and a lot of human elements to this that I think you'll all enjoy. But short version is he gets to keep his job, but in exchange, they basically say, we want to see some real improvements with this business. And so in an effort to sort of appease or please these new investors, he comes up with this big plan. The title of the chapter is literally like "Go Big or Go Home." Like, this was the idea. He's like, all right, we're coming out of COVID. Everyone's been home on their phones for 6 months. Usage is through the roof. We're going to keep this thing going, and we're going to, Twitter's going to emerge in 2 years as this massive business that it never had achieved. And the pressure of trying to, please these investors creates this really unrealistic goal, financial goals for the company, and they share them publicly, and everyone's excited, and the stock investors are like sending the stock up because they're like, great, we're gonna see all this growth. And again, the reason I feel like this is so important is very shortly after all this happens, it becomes clear that they're not going to hit any of these goals. They basically set themselves up for financial failure. And by the time Elon shows up about 2 years later, it's actually 18 months later, the public doesn't necessarily know this, but the board knows that they're on this path to basically Wall Street disaster, right? If they don't sell to Elon and he walks away, they're going to have to basically keep coming out quarter after quarter, and people are going to say, oh, wow, they don't look like they're going to hit this goal. Oh, wow, they definitely aren't going to hit this goal, right? And so you're forecasting a business, and if you're the board of Twitter, you're sitting there saying, we know what the future holds because we know we're not going to hit these things we had announced very ambitiously. And so Elon showing up and basically offering to buy the company at a very huge premium to the board is like Christmas comes early, right? Because this is their out. They suddenly don't have to worry about the fact that they overstated things. And these are the types of, we talked about Jack and talking about this. Like, these are the dominoes that I spend the first half of the book sort of trying to set up for people, because again, I think most people think Elon just showed up out of the blue, he bought the company, and they don't realize there were all these markers along the way that basically made this very possible. And I think that 3-year plan, the Go Big or Go Home plan, is a big reason that this was ultimately possible.
Let's shift a little bit to talk about Elon.
Sure.
Fascinating individual with a fascinating storied career and more businesses than could even keep track of in some ways. General consensus, I think, would be fair to say that Elon has struggled, or Twitter/X has struggled under Elon's leadership since taking over. Is that your take? And is there anything that you think has improved, or any successes that Elon has had within his tenure?
That is my take. As a business, I actually don't think it's really even disputable that X is struggling compared to what it was a few years ago. Revenue is down almost 50% with the same business model for the most part. And, Twitter, or now X, is a advertising business predominantly. And so the issue that I'm hearing when I go out and talk to advertisers is that they like to be in a safe space, right? These are the Disneys of the world, the Coca-Colas of the world. They want their brand to appear in a place that feels like it's going to be appreciated and not surrounded by questionable stuff. Elon's whole thing about buying Twitter was that he wanted to, restore his version of free speech, and that meant sort of eliminating some of the rules that cleaned things up. And so, now if you're Disney, you say, well, I'm using them just as a hypothetical example, by the way, but, they're saying, well, do we really want to put our family-friendly brand into this feed of stuff where we don't know what's going to show up there? It could be racist stuff. It could be misogynistic stuff. And, like, what's the value that we're getting, and is it worth the risk? And I think the biggest issue is that the biggest risky tweeter on the entire service is Elon himself, because he kind of just posts whatever pops into his head, and he has the sense of humor of a middle school boy in a lot of ways. And so you get, I won't even share them here in this beautiful institution, but you could go to his feed and see them for yourself. Like, they're just inappropriate. They're jokes that are sexist, and that's probably saying it kindly. And when that's the face of a company, these other big brands that I'm talking about are not interested in partnering. And so as a result, 90% of their revenue came from advertising, and a bunch of those advertisers have said, we just don't get enough value to deal with the BS that comes with this. We're gonna take it away. And so I think the business has really struggled as a result. And you asked for nice things too, right? Or good things? That was kind of a negative.
I think that's fairly telling that I asked for nice things, and
then I just said all the bad things. I will say one, I think Elon has gotten a lot of criticism for basically turning Twitter inside out. He took over, he fired half the company, he got rid of all the C-suite. He's trying to basically change the way the product even works. A lot of those things I don't think are the right decisions, but what I will say is that oftentimes when you do a takeover like this, you kind of have to be dramatically different. And I don't necessarily think the decisions that he's made have worked, but at the same time, it was clear that what they were doing before was not necessarily working long term. So, on the one hand, it's like he came in and he tried something different, which you kind of have to do. I just think what he tried has yet to materialize.
Let's look future-oriented for a bit.
Sure.
So I'm thinking about it in sort of two phases. So one, we're entering a robust national election cycle. Curious around your thoughts on what role or what Yeah, sort of like what's the level of a role that X may play within that piece there. And then maybe as you fast forward, and let's kind of keep on the election piece, as you imagine then 2028, what are your musings about what the potential future is for X in a longer trajectory?
So I think 2020 was the most consequential year for a ton of people, right? That was COVID, but I think with Twitter, it was consequential in hindsight in so many different ways. We talked about the 3-year plan that came out of 2020. There were two other things. One, COVID and misinformation around COVID became a huge focus for the company in the wake of everything that was going on. And it was sort of the first time that Twitter had said, we're going to, try to fact check this place. And it's obviously a very difficult thing to do at their scale. And it created a ton of problems for them because, it wasn't necessarily consistent. They were sort of doing it on the fly. As we all know, sort of the what we knew about the virus was evolving every single week. And so it just created a huge issue for them from a content moderation standpoint as they were trying to do this. Fast forward to the end of the year and the election happened. And they ultimately banned, Donald Trump permanently from the service. And that was another huge moment for this company because they were trying to figure out, they're starting to do misinformation around COVID. Well, now they're trying to do misinformation around the election and the election results. And it got so bad that they banned a sitting U.S. president from using their service. And so I bring that up because I feel like, not that we would ever all forget 2020 ever, but I think it's important to remember just how insane it was for these platforms. And then you look at 2024, so far, former President Trump hasn't really been using Twitter. I believe he has some exclusive agreements with Truth Social, which is his own sort of social network. So he can't really post to Twitter first. It's my understanding. But, you could see if that changes as we get closer to the election or after the election, and we see a repeat of what happens in 2020 where it's like, hey, these results are fraudulent. Hey, this was stolen from me. Hey, whatever. But you no longer have a company that really cares to do anything about that, right? And now, you see those types of things circulating in a way that maybe, even though they happened on Twitter, they were taken down from Twitter pretty quickly. I'm not a political scientist, so I can't say exactly like what that means or what the result of that is going to be, but I think we can all imagine how chaotic and crazy that could be. And it's not that hard to, to picture all those things happening.
Yeah. I want to switch gears just a little bit. And, you've been a journalist for a number of years. You were heavily involved in journalism here. Curious around that origin story a bit of like, what is it about journalism that sort of hooked you in and what has kept you in?
Yeah. I was pretty confident that I was going to be a Major League Baseball player until I was not very good at baseball, okay. Which was a bummer. So when I got to Santa Clara, not to play baseball, by the way, I thought, well, maybe I'll write about sports because I grew up reading Sports Illustrated and I just thought this is the next best thing to basically like being an athlete is getting to hang out and like cover athletes. So I went down to the newspaper and started covering sports as sort of like a freelancer. Sort of a fun story. I was I also volunteered to practice with the women's basketball team here. So I literally, first day, there was like a pep rally, I think, or something in Levy Center, and the women's basketball coach came out and like got everyone excited, and I ran down on the court afterwards and was like, hey, do you ever need like men to throw on some shoes and come play basketball? And they said yes, and because of that, they gave me priority class registration because I had to build my schedule around the basketball practice. So as a true freshman, I was suddenly like registering for classes with like all the seniors. So I got into a bunch of great journalism classes like as a freshman, which is usually not how that works. And I'd probably be lying if I said like, oh, this was my passion from day one and I just like knew I had to be a journalist. I think I thought I was kind of good at it and I enjoyed it. And Gordon Young, who was one of my professors, was like, hey, basically the entire newspaper staff is graduating. We're looking for an editor-in-chief. What do you think? And so by the end of my freshman year, I was literally editing the school newspaper. And I'm super glad that it played out that way, but I think it would also be sort of revisionist history to, create some story about how I was like a diehard journalist who just knew this is what I had to do. I kind of feel like I fell into it and really, really loved it once I started doing it.
Great. We might edit some of that for the magazine story, but we can sort that out afterwards. But one of the things that's sort of most prominent for me is, you've been a journalist, and I know your beat is specifically within technology, and we talk about that a lot with the book.
Yeah.
I'm curious kind of more of just less about your beat and more about just you as a journalist. Fascinating time in history in terms of, and actually specifically, like the role and impact of Twitter on journalism and news and in general, the expectations about flow of information. Then this massive sort of thread related to misinformation and what's an accurate source and how do you do kind of like where does truth lie in issues of free speech, and I understand that these are kind of always prominent issues within a field of journalism. It just feels like there's a prescient dimension to it right now that's just incredible.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a tough time. It's a very tough time to be in media generally. For those who have not followed, a lot of my peers and competing publications have been doing layoffs. It's not a very lucrative business at the moment. And I think what you're describing, this sort of tension between, truth and not truth, and can the mainstream sort of media still be reliable or believable? I think it's hard to say that didn't start in 2016 when we had a president who constantly said that everything that he didn't agree with was fake news, right? And it sort of just created this reality where a division, I should say, between people who believed what they read and people who didn't. And I don't think we've recovered from that at all. If anything, I think it's probably gotten worse. And it's really hard to see, quite frankly, as someone who not only takes my own job very seriously, but is surrounded by other great colleagues who do great work. And a lot of times it can just be dismissed simply because we are journalists, right? And I think Elon Musk, quite frankly, at X has kind of gone out of his way to attack journalism and the mainstream media as well. And we've seen a bunch of changes that he's made to Twitter, now X, that have been negative, in my opinion, for journalism. And it's I don't really know where we go from here because the business itself isn't super healthy. So it's not as if there's a ton of new jobs that are cropping up or whatever. But obviously I feel like this is an incredibly important industry, and more so now probably than ever before, because you have people and services like Twitter, quite frankly, that make it very easy to distribute misinformation and things like that. And so, I feel like I'm sort of rambling here, but this is a really important part of what we're doing right now and what we're facing as a society. And I'm not really sure how it gets improved. So go start a journalism career.
I mean, we didn't have expectations for you to come and solve the issues of journalism tonight, but we can get into that tomorrow maybe. But curious around, so obviously everyone here in the room is excited that you're a product of Santa Clara.
Thanks.
And so thinking about just, what are some of the aspects of your experience at Santa Clara? Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be like sort of specific things I did X or Y or Z, but just more of a broader picture. As you think about and reflect on your time at Santa Clara, how have you seen sort of threads of the impact of that over your time?
I think, I mentioned Gordon Young as just one example, but I think being at Santa Clara, especially a school of Santa Clara's size, I had so many close relationships with people who were supportive of my career, quite frankly, and me as a human outside of just, trying to get me a job as a journalist. The fact that you are here interviewing me right now after, what'd you say, 14 years ago that we met, right? I'm pretty sure I sent you an email that was like, hey, I wrote a book, and your first thing was like, this is amazing. How can we get you back to, make this successful, right? And I would hope that exists at other places. Like, I hope everyone who goes to college like has that support system. But I can say that here at Santa Clara, that's happened repeatedly. And I still am in touch with Gordon and stay in touch with him and Barbara Kelly, who's another member of the communications and journalism team. And that's pretty special, right? To have those relationships and those mentors who are willing to take time out of their lives to make sure that you succeed and help you succeed. And so that's one thing that certainly, can't be overlooked about my time here.
Yeah, appreciate that. We're going to do one more question and then open it up to audience questions. But this is not to say that, understand, we know that, not all of your values that you hold as Kurt sort of come from your time at Santa Clara, and obviously it also was a formative time for you. So we know there's a piece to that. But I'm kind of curious around, as you think about yourself as a journalist and some of those values that you hold on to for yourself as you do your work, what are some of those values that you feel are, these are the kind of like the rocks that I stand on as I am trying to go through my work?
I talked a little bit about the importance of people in these stories, right? And in some cases, it's just like, hey, this is a really interesting person. But I think it's also just recognizing that these are human beings, right? And even if they're Elon Musk and have more money than they know what to do with, or they're a rank and file employee at the company, like, they're people and they're going through things. And I think trying to report while appreciating the impact on the individual is something that sounds somewhat obvious, but I think it's really easy to lose that, especially when you're covering business, because business is usually sort of people removed. And my capstone. So I wasn't a journalism major because we don't have that, or at least they didn't when I was here. But I did a journalism capstone, and my senior year story was about the Jesuits here at Santa Clara actually funding scholarships for undocumented students. And it was not a known program, as far as I know. It wasn't like a huge secret, but it certainly wasn't something that was advertised. And so I wrote a whole magazine story about how the Jesuits were giving 25 students full ride scholarships to Santa Clara, and even spoke to some of the students, which was really great. And I keep coming back to that story, even though it was 14 years ago or whatever it was, because talk about a people first story, right? And it's truly looking at the human beings that are impacted and the lives that are affected by something. And so, that was the first magazine story I ever wrote, right? And it'd be a little idealistic or to pretend like every time I go write a story, I'm sitting here like thinking of that. But at the same time, you do think about those things as you talk to people. And I think that starts with the foundation that I got here as a journalism student.
Excellent. Thanks, Kurt. Want to be able to open it up to folks in the audience. And we have, Aaron's got a microphone, if folks wouldn't mind using that. So thinking about the book, specifics about the content, also the process of writing a book, career in journalism, or Seattle sports are all on the docket. So any questions from folks for Kurt? Thanks, Aaron.
So I got a question. So as I mentioned before, I'm doing a project about Twitter. So I've also done my research about this platform, social platform. And I think one of the major problem is that the users are leaving Twitter and they face the problem of not attracting enough more new users. Like, what's the major reason that you think people stop using Twitter, and do you think it's like culture-wise, or is this the fault of Elon Musk?
Thanks for the question. Some of it's definitely the fallout of Elon Musk. There are a lot of people who simply just, don't feel that they align with his views or his mission with Twitter, and so they don't want to support that, right? And that happens with any company, right? There are certain people who just simply say, I don't want to support this company because I disagree with what they're doing. I also think there's an element of Twitter that I've noticed as a user. I'm still a user of X, but I don't find it nearly as valuable as I used to. And I kind of alluded to some of the changes that have been made that I think are bad for journalism. I think the thing that Twitter was best at, quite frankly, was news, right? Like, it was the place you went to figure out what was happening right now in the world around you. And that was sort of the superpower of Twitter. I think that's why it was always like limited in its growth, because not everyone loves news, not everyone cares enough about news, but it was really good at that. And some of the changes that Elon has made, including he took away, for those who aren't on Twitter, they used to have probably 1 million or so users who had these blue check marks next to their name. And that meant that the company had confirmed, like, that's a real person. That's Kurt Wagner, who works at Bloomberg, and that's his account. And most of the people, or not most, but a lot of the people who had blue checks were journalists. And so when you would go on in a breaking news situation, anytime you saw a blue check come in your feed, at the very least you would kind of know, okay, like, that's a real human. I know it's the person whose name is on the account because Twitter's already checked that out. And, for the most part, I can trust what they're saying, or at least feel that I'm hearing from a reliable source. I mentioned that Elon isn't really a huge fan of the media, so he took all those away. And instead just said anyone who wants to pay $8 a month can get a blue check mark. And so what it's done, in my opinion, is it's just simply eliminated the speed and ease in which you can get news from Twitter, right? So you take this thing that its superpower is news, and you start to erode it immediately, and that's what he did. And so for me as a user, it's not nearly as useful at the thing that it was super useful at. And I don't think that I'm alone in feeling that way. So I imagine, as people leave Twitter, part of the reason is because they're just not getting as much value from it as they used to. Now, of course, other people are going to come and perhaps fill that space. So I don't want to pretend like people can't get value from Twitter anymore. But I do think it's gotten worse at the thing that it was best at. Yeah. So there's a bunch of different Twitter clones, I suppose, that have cropped up. Threads is one, which is owned by Meta, Instagram. Blue Sky is another one. I don't really think Twitter replacing Twitter in the same way is actually possible. I kind of think we've splintered as a social media ecosystem a little bit, and I think when Twitter started, what made it super interesting was that it was able to get the newsmakers of the world all in one place, right? For some reason, it had whole teams of people whose job was to do this, by the way, like to engage with politicians and celebrities and stuff. But they did a good job, right? Every celebrity was on Twitter. Every politician was on Twitter. Every journalist was on Twitter. And they somehow convinced all of these different groups that they needed to be on this one platform. And that's what made it kind of cool, right? Because you could hear from these newsmakers. I don't think you could convince all of those different groups that they need to do anything in 2024. And so if you're starting a new service like Threads, you're going to get people who are, don't feel great about Twitter that are going to migrate over, but you're not going to get the same pockets of newsmakers that Twitter did. And as a result, it's never going to have the same level of necessity to a observer. That's my opinion. Maybe someone will be able to recreate it, but I kind of feel like at this point, social media has been around long enough that a lot of people are like, I don't need it in my life in the way that they maybe felt they did in 2012, for example.
You brought up Blue Sky.
Yeah.
I'm just sort of curious. There's a big part of the book about Jack Dorsey and Blue Sky and this potential of, can you create a social media platform that's separated out from advertisers and the business side? Just kind of curious around your take about that's a lofty vision. Mm-hmm. Do you imagine is there a dimension of viability to that?
The biggest hurdle has been how can you build a business to sustain these new things? And advertising is the most obvious because, you have an audience and That's what has worked historically. But we've already talked about the trade-off between, free speech and advertising and the tensions there. I think the issue is going to come down to, like, can someone come up with a better business idea? And the only other thing that seems to be floated around are subscriptions, right? Are you willing to pay to use this thing on a monthly basis? But again, no one has figured out a suite of features or perks that are worth paying for the majority of people. And so as a result, I mean, I think Blue Sky is an interesting idea for those who aren't familiar. Imagine Twitter, but instead of owned by a particular like single company that makes the decisions, it's what's called open source. So, it's not owned by anybody really. And it's much more complicated than that. I'm very, very surface level talking about it, but in theory, that sounds really great, right? Like, oh, cool, it's Twitter, but there's no singular entity that's going to make all the decisions. In practice, I just think that's a lot harder to not only build, but to support, because someone has to be footing the bill for this, and it's not an easy business to figure out.
Tony?
Thank you, Kurt. I was wondering if we could return to the journalism discussion, and I guess I'll share an observation I have, and then I just want to hear your reaction or thoughts. I mean, I observed it in myself, as I used to have Twitter or X, and regarding news, and I hear you on that was perhaps its greatest feature, but I became so used to just reading the headlines, right? And I noticed myself not clicking and reading the work of journalists, and so I had to rebel against that and just dive into the New York Times, right? So I was wondering if you could speak to Twitter's impact on journalism, like that we've lost the ability to read a long article.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think your experience is probably shared by almost everyone, including myself, who uses Twitter. Is that you scroll, right, and you pick up snippets here and there, and very rarely do you say, "Oh, I want to dive deep on this." And oftentimes, when you do, you hit a paywall, and the reality is most people are not going to pay for 10 different news outlets. I run into this all the time, and it's a total bummer, right? Because unfortunately, like, that's how you fund good work is you need people to do that, but it's also not reasonable for everyone to pay for 20 different subscriptions. So I agree. I suppose, with your observation, and I think, when you go back in time, and if you could ask the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, just as flagship news organizations, would you have put everything online for free when you first got on the internet, 25 years ago or whatever it was? Would you do it that way again? And I think the answer would be absolutely not, right? I think we've all learned that there was a huge mistake by giving all this hard work away for free. People underestimated exactly how popular Facebook and Twitter and other places were going to be. And unfortunately, the impact has been that now people expect it for free. And so when you throw a paywall in front of them, they say, well, I could just read a summary of this at another website that scrapes it and throws it up there. And I think, not to get too doomsday, but when you add in generative AI too, right, we're heading down that path even more, because then it's like someone can replicate your story in an instant and put it up for free. And so I'm identifying a lot of problems without offering many solutions today. So I apologize to my colleagues in the industry for that. But I think you're right, and I think Twitter and Facebook have really changed the game, or did really change the game in that way.
Thanks, Kurt. Ultimately, what do you think Elon Musk wants? Like, what is, as much as one could even figure that out, but what is his idea of success? Where's his end game? Does he have an end game?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question, because I don't know the answer.
That could be your next book.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I might have to change topics after this one. We know what he has said that he wants, right? Which is this idea of free speech and a place where people can go and feel that they can say their mind without feeling that they're going to get, removed or canceled or whatever. I actually think most reasonable people would be like, of course, like, wouldn't that be great, right? There should be a platform for that. I don't think it's quite as pure as the stated intention is, in my opinion. And so trying to figure out what he wants is tough. I think maybe there's a kernel of that's true, that he thinks, that this is what Twitter can be and should be. But I think he kind of gets sidetracked by his own whims and ego sometimes. And he's certainly become, the main character of his own story in a lot of ways that I think he enjoys. I think he enjoys being the attention that he gets on Twitter as being the owner and a big user. And I think sometimes those things get in the way of the mission that he set out to accomplish. And I'm not sure that you can fix that. That's an Elon Musk thing to fix, right? And I just don't see that really changing.
Hey, Kurt, maybe just stepping back even broader to just social media in the industry as a whole. So certainly Twitter, we've talked about sort of where it's headed. Facebook, we're hearing about just the active users, the subscriptions gone down, migrating to TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat. Just in your view, where do you think social media sort of will move to?
Yeah. It feels like it's moving much more private to me. I know, again, use case of one, but I've actually brought this up often, many times with other people who have been like, yeah, we do that too, which is I have 2 little kids now. I never post their photos on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. We've created a private photo album through Apple and invited, 20 people to do that, right? We've basically taken the idea of social media. We post, you can go, you can look, you can comment, you can like, but we've privatized it. And I think that's going to continue to happen. We see that with WhatsApp too. Like, a lot of people have moved sort of to WhatsApp groups, iMessage groups. It doesn't feel like social media because it doesn't have the scroll in the same way. But I think it's related because it's to do with sharing, right? The original idea of social media was, how can I share what I'm doing with the people that I want to know about that, and how can I also see what they're doing? And so I think the sharing is still happening, but it's happening in these closed groups, because I think people have sort of come to this realization they don't necessarily want their entire life online. I don't know if it's going to, I think maybe there's a nice spectrum, right? I have, every so often I can post on Instagram and show the world what I'm up to. Sometimes I can, go and do this private group thing. And then obviously sometimes you just go and send a picture to your parents or siblings or whatever. But I do feel like the sharing element is just going to become more and more private as we move forward. I don't know if that fully answers the question.
Yeah, it's curious though, because TikTok is just
Sure. I guess I don't think of TikTok. I think of TikTok as entertainment more so than social media. And maybe maybe I'm splitting hairs here, or maybe I'm too old to appreciate TikTok. But TikTok to me feels more like YouTube. It feels more like, it's creators. Yeah, it's content consumption. Whereas I think of social media as more user-generated posts. And obviously you can do that on TikTok, and a ton of people do, but it feels to me like most of what I see on TikTok when I go on there is a creation from someone who's doing it for a living. So it just feels a little bit different. Yeah.
We've got time for 1 or 2 more questions.
This question isn't fully baked yet, so apologies for that. But you had the opportunity to interview a lot of people, perhaps a lot of influential people, involved in a pretty exciting entity in Silicon Valley. And I'm just curious if there's any sort of insights into human nature, into qualities of people that emerged from you as you had these many conversations and watched these interviews and had the exposure that you did to all these different types of people.
That's a great question. I think that 2 things, and they as I'm formulating them in my head, they sound kind of negative, which I feel like has unfortunately been the theme of journalists, are just really negative people. But one is like, a lot of people who seem like they have these really great jobs at great companies, whatever, are still dealing with like a lot of the same BS that all of us are dealing with at our own jobs. You know, you sit down and talk to them, and it's like there's team dysfunction and manager dysfunction and company dysfunction. And I just think from the outside, oftentimes you see a title or you see this obviously success of a person, and you kind of, at least for me, I think, wow, like they sure got it figured out. Like their job, you know, they got this great VP job at a great big company, and like they're making great money. And then once you kind of talk to people, you realize like everyone's sort of going through their own version of the same thing, which is sort of refreshing, honestly, because you start to realize like it's possible for anyone to kind of achieve these things. And I don't mean that to belittle the people who do make it to the top, but more so say that like it's not as closed off, I think, as maybe a lot of people think. And so I kind of morphed my ideas. I think my second one was just sort of like that these people are humans, and we've kind of hit that theme a few times. But again, I've gotten to interview some really awesome people over the years, you know, Mark Zuckerberg and Evan Spiegel and Jack Dorsey, and like these huge names in the tech and business world. And the more you spend time with them, the more you just realize they're regular people. Like they're really smart, and they're obviously incredibly successful and rich, but like they're still human. They're still humans with flaws and other things. And I feel like that's actually one of the things I like most about my job, is sort of just kind of breaking down that exterior of how you view someone from the outside.
We're at time, so I'm just going to close with a couple of words of thanks. So there's a number of folks who made the event possible. So within the Ignatian Center, in particular, Allison Benders, Aaron Willis, Mary Barsh, Nina Moda, thank you for your support. Career Center, especially Dylan Houle, thank you. Library and Learning Commons, thank you to Nicole Branch in particular for supporting. Alumni Association, especially Jenny Sullivan. And Communications Department, and in particular Mike Whalen, Gordon Young, and Barbara Kelly. Big thanks to all of you for coming. Thank you very much. And then to you, Kurt, thanks for coming, for the work you do. And I think in particular, there's a number of us who work here, and sort of like one of the main drivers with working in higher ed is sort of this long-term viewpoint. So we get to see folks at a certain point in time, and then they go off, and you sort of cross your fingers and hope that things go well. But it's really wonderful opportunity to be able to see folks, particularly for you and for your wonderful partner, Jess, just sort of living lives and dealing with the grind, but with a sense of integrity and compassion and empathy in what you do. And it's a great gift to us. So thanks for sharing it today.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. Like I said, this is a super awesome thrill for me to come do this. So I really appreciate your support. And thank you, Mike.
Thanks.